History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8, The Latest Age. Chapter 4, The Closing of an Era. The End of the Cold War World. Besides its demographic and communal diversity, the Yugoslav census of 1931 distinguished Serbo-Croats, Slovenes, Germans, Magyars, Romanians, Albanians, Turks, other Slavs, Jews, Gypsies, and Italians. Yugoslavia also displayed wide disparities of custom, wealth, and economic development. In parts of it, the Middle Ages had barely faded away in 1950, while others were modern, urbanized, and contained significant industry. Overall, what were mainly agricultural economies had been impoverished by fast growing populations. Yet, Yugoslav politics between the German wars had turned out to be, in the main, about a Croat Serb antagonism. And this was deepened by wartime atrocity and struggle in a three-sided civil war between Croatians and the mainly Serb communists and Serb royalists after 1941. This struggle began with the Campaign of Terror and ethnic cleansing launched against the 2 million Serbs of the new Croatia. It ended in communist victory in 1945 and the effective containment of nationalities by Tito's dictatorship within a federal structure. This seemed to solve the old Bosnian and Macedonian problems and was likely to be able to ward off the territorial ambitions of outsiders. 45 years later and 10 years after Tito's death, however, the old issues suddenly revealed themselves to be still vigorously alive. In 1990, the Yugoslav federal government's attempts to deal with its economic troubles were accompanied by accelerating political fragmentation. Democratic self-determination finally undid the Tito achievement as Yugoslavs of different nationalities began to cast about to find ways of filling the political vacuum left by the collapse of the communism. Parties formed representing Serb, Croat, Macedonian, and Slovene interests as well as one in favor of the Yugoslav idea and the federation itself. Soon, all the Republican governments except that of Macedonia rested on elected majorities, and new national minority parties had even begun to make themselves heard inside the individual republics. Croatian Serbs declared their own autonomy, and there was bloodshed in the Serbian province of Kosovo, 4/5 of whose inhabitants were Albanian. The proclamation of an independent republic there had been a major symbolic affront to the Serbians, as well as of concern to the Greek and Bulgarian governments whose predecessors had not ceased to cherish Macedonian ambitions since the day of the Balkan Wars. In August, sporadic fighting by air and ground forces had begun between Serbs and Croats. Precedents for intervention by outsiders did not ever seem promising, though different views were held by different European community countries. And prospects for it became even less attractive when the USSR, in July, uttered a warning about the dangers of spreading local conflict to the international level. By the end of the year, Macedonia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Slovenia had all, like Croatia, declared themselves independent. The Soviet warning was the last diplomatic demarche of the regime. It was soon eclipsed by a much more momentous event. On 19th August, a still mysterious attempt was made to set aside Mikhail Gorbachev by coup d'etat. It failed, and 3 days later he was again in occupation of the presidency. Nonetheless, his position was not the same. Continual changes of side in a search for compromise had ruined his political credibility. He had clung too long to the party and the Union. Soviet politics had taken a further lurch forward. in the eyes of many, towards disintegration. The circumstances of the coup had given an opportunity which he seized to Boris Yeltsin, the leader of the Russian Republic, the largest in the Union. The army, the only conceivable threat to his supporters, did not move against him. He now appeared both as a strong man of the Soviet scene, without whose concurrence nothing could be done, and as a possible standard bearer for Russian chauvinism that might threaten other republics. While foreign observers waited to understand the purging of those who had supported or acquiesced in the coup was developed into a determined replacement of the Union officialdom at all levels. The redefinition of the roles for the KGB and the redistribution of control over it between the Union and the republics. The most striking change of all was the demolition of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which began almost at once. Almost bloodlessly, at least to begin with, the huge creation which had grown out of the Bolshevik coup of 1917 was coming to an end. There seemed at good first grounds for rejoicing over that, although it was not clear that nothing but good would follow. Nor was that easier to see as the year came to an end, with the decision to abandon price controls in the Russian Republic in the near future. It seemed likely that not only inflation, unparalleled since the earliest days of the Soviet system, but also perhaps starvation too, would soon face millions of Russians. In another republic, Georgia, fighting had already broken out between the supporters of the president elected after the first free elections there and the discontented opposition. Dwarfing all such facts, though, was the end of the giant superpower which had emerged from the bloody experiments of the Bolshevik Revolution. For nearly 70 years and almost to the end, it was the hope of revolutionaries around the world and the generator of military strength that had won the greatest land campaigns in history. Now, it dissolved suddenly and helplessly into a set of successor states. The last of the great European multinational empires disappeared when Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian leaders met at Minsk on 8th December and announced the end of the Soviet Union and the establishment of a new Commonwealth of independent states. On 21st December 1991, a gathering of representatives from 11 of the former republics met briefly at Alma-Ata to confirm this. They agreed that the formal end of the Union would come on the last day of the year. Almost immediately, Gorbachev resigned. It was the climax of one of the most startling and important changes of modern history. Of what lay ahead, no one could be sure, except that it would be a period of danger, difficulty, and for many former Soviet citizens, misery. In other countries, politicians were rarely tempted to express more than caution over the turn events had taken. There was too much uncertainty ahead. As for the USSR's former friends, they were silent. A few of them had deplored the turn of the events earlier in the year, so much that they had expressed approval or encouragement for the failed coup of August. Cold War groupings was bound to arouse their hopes of renewed possibilities of international maneuver that had been constricted first by détente between the USA and USSR, and then by the growing powerlessness of the latter. China. Events in the USSR must have followed with great interest in China. Its rulers had their own reasons for uneasiness about the direction in which the events appeared to be going on the other side of their longest land frontier after the collapse of communism there. With the Soviet Union's disappearance, they were the rulers of the only multinational empire still intact. Moreover, China had been engaged since 1978 in a continuing process of caution and controlled modernization. Deng Xiaoping came to be seen as the dominating influence in this, but he worked in a collective leadership. Scope was to be given to local and community enterprise and the profit motive. Commercial ties with non-communist countries began to be encouraged. Although the new course was defined in appropriately Marxist language, the outcome seemed to be a substantial liberalization of the economy, but in fact showed no weakening of the will to power of the regime. China's rulers remained firmly in control and intended to do so. They were helped by the persistence of the old Chinese social disciplines, by the relief felt by millions that the Cultural Revolution had been left behind, by the cult of Mao's memory, and by the policy that economic rewards should flow through the system to the peasant. This built up rural purchasing power and that made for contentment in the countryside. There was a major swing of power away from the rural communes, which in many places practically ceased to be relevant. And by 1985, the family farm was back as the dominant form of rural production over much of China. For all the complaints of the critics that China was resuming, the capitalist road, tender consciences were assuaged by talk of socialism with Chinese characteristics and a prudent pragmatism about local interests and regional differences. Village industrial and commercial enterprise emerged from the communes and brigades of the era of the Great Leap. By the mid 1980s, a half of rural income was drawn from industrial deployment. In some regions, special economic areas, enclaves for free trade with the capitalist world were set up. The first, as at Canton, the historic point of contact of China with the West. By 1986 too, China was the largest coal producer in the world and the fourth largest of steel. GDP, it was claimed, rose at a rate of more than 10% a year between 1978 and 1986. Industrial output doubled in that time, and per capita peasant income nearly tripled. By 1988, the average peasant family was said to have about 6 months' income in the savings bank. In a longer perspective, the value of foreign trade per capita multiplied roughly 25 times between 1950 and the mid 1980s. Psychologically, the regime's success was buttressed too by the agreements for the resumption of Hong Kong and Macau. The new policy was not without costs, however. Growing urban markets encouraged farmers and gave them profits to plow back, but the city dwellers began to feel the effects of rising prices. As the decade progressed, though, domestic difficulties increased. Foreign debt had shot up and inflation was running at an annual rate of about 30% by the end of the decade. There was anger over evidence of corruption and divisions in the leadership were widely known to exist. Those believing that a reassertion of political control was needed began to gain ground, and there were signs that they were maneuvering to win over Deng Xiaoping. Yet, Western observers and perhaps some Chinese had been led by the policy of economic liberalization to take unrealistic and over-optimistic views about the possibility of political relaxation. The exciting changes in Eastern Europe stimulated further hopes of this, but the illusion suddenly crumbled. As 1989 began, China's city dwellers were feeling the pressures both of the acute inflation and of the austerity program that had been imposed to deal with it. This was the background to a new wave of student demands, encouraged by the presence of sympathizers with liberalization in the governing oligarchy. They demanded that the party and government should open dialogue with a newly formed and unofficial student union about corruption and reform. Posters and rallies began to champion calls for greater democracy. The regime's leadership was alarmed, refusing to recognize the Union, which it was feared might be the harbinger of a new Red Cards movement. As the 70th anniversary of the 4th May movement approached, activists invoked its memory so as to give a broad patriotic color to their campaign. They were not able to arouse much support in the countryside, although there were sympathetic demonstrations in many cities. But encouraged by the obviously benevolent attitude of the General Secretary of the CCP, Zhao Ziyang, they began a mass hunger strike that won widespread popular sympathy for support in Beijing. It had started only shortly before Gorbachev arrived in the capital. His state visit, instead of providing further reassuring evidence of China's international standing, only served to remind people of what was going on in the USSR as a result of policies of liberalization. This cut both ways, encouraging would-be reformers and frightening conservatives. By this time, the most senior members of the government, including Deng Xiaoping, seemed to have become thoroughly alarmed. Widespread disorder might be in the offing. They believed China faced a major crisis. Some feared a new cultural revolution if things got out of control. On May 20th, 1989, martial law was declared. There were signs for a moment that a divided government might not be able to impose its will, but the army's reliability was soon assured. The repression that followed 2 weeks later was ruthless. The student leaders had moved the focus of their efforts to an encampment in Beijing in Tiananmen Square, where 40 years before Mao had proclaimed the foundation of the People's Republic, and they had been joined there by other dissidents. From one of the gates of the old Forbidden City, a huge portrait of Mao looked down on the symbol of the protesters. A plaster figure of a goddess of democracy, deliberately evocative of New York's Statue of Liberty. On 2nd June, the first military units entered the suburbs of Beijing on their way to the square. There was resistance with extemporized weapons and barricades that they forced their way through. On 3rd June, the demonstrators were overcome by rifle fire, tear gas, and a brutal crushing of the encampment under the treads of tanks that swept into the square. Killing went on for some days. Mass arrests followed. Much of what happened took place before the eyes of the world, thanks to the presence of foreign film crews who had for days familiarized television audiences with the demonstrators' encampment. Foreign disapproval was almost universal. Yet, as so often in China, it is hard to know what had really happened. Obviously, China's rulers felt they faced a grave threat. It is probable, too, that they acted in a way deplored and opposed by many of their fellow Chinese. There was disorder, some of it serious, in over 80 cities, and the army encountered resistance in some working class districts of Beijing. Yet the masses did not rise to support the protesters. They were often hostile to them. Much was to be made in future years of Tiananmen as evidence of Chinese disregard of human rights, but it cannot be confidently asserted that China would have been bound to benefit if the party had given way to the student movement. More Asian lives were shattered by banking fiascos in the 1990s than in China's troubles in 1989. Although the party and ruling hierarchy were somewhat in disarray, vigorous attempts to impose political orthodoxy followed. Neo-Marxist slogans were heard again. Discipline was reimposed in the party. Economic liberalization was, for a time, reined in. China, it was soon clear, was not going to go the way of Eastern Europe or the USSR. But where was it going? Perhaps the safest conclusion to be drawn at this stage is that it was once again moving to its own rhythms, stimulated by forces peculiar to it, for all the rhetoric of regime and protesters alike. The youngsters in Tiananmen Square who met the tanks not only put up a statue as their icon of liberty, but also showed what they had owed to another non Chinese and Western inspiration by signing the Internationale. That suggests both the complexity of the opposition movement and its alienation from much that was still influential in China. As recently as 1987, a poll had reported that even among urban Chinese, the moral defect that was most strongly deplored was that of filial disobedience, transformed though so much of the world already was. China, after Tiananmen Square, still baffled observers and futurologists by its seemingly massive immunity to currents outside its borders. One of the traditional roles of its governments had always been to act as the guardian of Chinese values. If anywhere in the world modernization might turn out in the end not to mean westernization, it could be China. 2000 years of history do not easily go away. Chapter 5, Openings and Closures, Nationality and Ethnicity. Well before the collapse of the USSR, it was clear that very little of the world would remain wholly unaffected by what was happening in Europe. Immediately, the end of the Cold War reawoke old questions of identity throughout that continent and beyond, as well as presenting new ones. Peoples began to see themselves and others afresh in the light of what soon turned out to be, for some, a chilly dawn. Some nightmares had blown away, but only to reveal troubled landscapes. Fundamental questions about identity, ethnicity, and religion could again be asked, and some of these questions were disturbing. Once again, new determining circumstances were emerging in world history. Almost incidentally, not only had one half of Europe's security arrangements disappeared with the Warsaw Pact, but the other half, NATO, had also been subtly changed. The collapse of the USSR, the major potential opponent, had deprived the alliance not only of its main role, but also of the pressure that had shaped it. Like a blancmange in a warm room, it began to sag a little, even if, as some thought, a revived Russia were to emerge as a new threat at some future date. The disappearance of the ideological struggle would mean that potential opponents would have to think in new ways about it. There were soon ex communist countries seeking to join NATO. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined up in 1999, and Slovenia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania, and the Baltic countries followed 5 years later. In total, contravention of the promises US President George H.W. Bush had given Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990. NATO had expanded not just up to the borders of the Soviet Union, but beyond them. The alliance had become an instrument for linking most of Europe, minus Russia, to the United States. But the purpose of its military power was by no means clear, even if in the mid 1990s the American government began to look to NATO as a machine for dealing with the new European problems, notably in the former Yugoslavia, and for use outside the European area. After the Cold War, the fate of the peoples in Eastern and Southeastern Europe seemed for the first time in the century entirely and evidently in their own hands. Like the old dynastic empires or the extemporizations of the German and Italian dictators in the Second World War, The communist scaffolding of the region had now collapsed. As much buried history re emerged and more was remembered or invented. What appeared was often discouraging. Slovaks felt restive about their inclusion in Czechoslovakia, and Slovakia itself had a large Hungarian percentage in its population, as did Romania. Hungarians could now agonize more openly over the treatment of Magyars, both north and east of their borders. Above all, old issues escalated rapidly into new violence and crisis in the former Yugoslavia. In 1991, as all former republics of the Yugoslav federal state declared their independence, wars were being fought between local Serbs and the new governments of Croatia and Bosnia Herzegovina. The Serb minorities were supported by the government in Belgrade, headed by the militant Serb nationalist Slobodan Milosevic, and by the remnants of the Yugoslav Federal Army. The civil war in Bosnia Herzegovina led to the worst atrocities against civilians in Europe since the end of the World War II, as the three main ethnic groups, Serbs, Croats, and Muslim Bosniaks, tried to control as much territory as possible, often driving out the other population groups as they advanced. At Srebrenica, Serb forces massacred several thousand Bosniak civilians in 1995, and Serbs besieged the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo, from 1992 to 1995. Both the EU and the United States were reluctant to intervene, and it was only the military setbacks for the Serbs that made an agreement possible at Dayton, Ohio, in December 1995. From being a peaceful mosaic of different ethnic groups, Bosnia Herzegovina had given rise to the term ethnic cleansing, the expulsion by force of people who were defined as enemies. Croatia made use of the decline in Serb military fortunes throughout the region to reclaim Krajina, driving out many of the majority Serb population there. Having gone from one disaster to another, in his so-called defense of the Serbs, Milosevic was finally toppled in 2000 after his heavy-handed policy in the Albanian-dominated region of Kosovo had led to NATO intervention against his troops. Fearful of a repetition of the Bosnian atrocities, the Western Allies had at last found agreement to intervene. Thus, the early 1990s left millions of East Europeans facing grave problems and difficulties. Agreement was lacking on legitimating principles and ideas. Insofar as the region had possessed modernizing elites, these, whether effective or not, were usually to be found in the old communist hierarchies. Unavoidably, professionals, managers, and experts whose careers had been made within the communist structures continued to govern because there was no one to replace them. Another problem was the fickleness of populations now voting freely as the immediate euphoria of political revolution ebbed. There was nostalgia for the apparent security of the old days. As people cast about for a new basis for the legitimacy of the state, the only plausible candidate often seemed to be the nationalism that had so often bedeviled past politics, sometimes for centuries. Old tribalisms had quickly resurfaced, and imaginary histories were soon turning out to matter as much as what had actually happened in the past. Some ancient confrontations had tragically been brought to an end by the Second World War. In the most horrifying and greatest instance, the Holocaust of people who had come to call the Nazis' attempt to extirpate the Jewish people had ended the story of Eastern Europe as the center of the world. Jewry. In 1901, three-quarters of the world's Jews had lived there, mostly in the Russian Empire. In those once Yiddish-speaking areas, only a little more than 10% of Jews now live. Nearly half of the world's Jews are now to be found in English-speaking countries and another 30% of them in Israel. In Eastern Europe, communist parties anxious to exploit traditional popular anti-Semitism, not least in the Soviet Union, had encouraged immigration by harrying and judicial persecution. In a few countries, this virtually eliminated what was left in 1945 of the Jewish population as a significant demographic element. 200,000 Polish Jews surviving in 1945 had soon found themselves again victims of traditional pogrom and harassment, and by 1990, those who had not immigrated numbered a mere 6,000. The heart of the old Eastern European Jewry had gone.